statue, the gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar, he gets his dream interpreted that he's the head of gold, and then we have the silver and the bronze and the iron, but he kind of gets a arrogant take on that and makes a whole statue of gold. And that's when he's trying to unite his kingdom under the ministry of music. And that is when we have the fiery furnace situation where Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael refuse to bow, and they are thrown into the into the fiery furnace and rescued, right, by one that looks like the Son of Man. And God, that's part of God just showing Nebuchadnezzar who he is, that he is the Most High. And the whole nation, really, because remember, all the officials were there and got to witness that. Then in Daniel 4, we think it was around they say around 570 is, this Nebuchadnezzar is passed. We've had a few kings, and then we have Nabonidus and Belshazzar, who is his co-regent in charge of Babylon. And that's when they drink out of the vessels and the handwriting on the wall. And that's when the Babylonian captivity ends. But now the Medo-Persia government comes in under King Cyrus or Darius. And then we jump over to 539 in chapter 5, where we see that, that's not Daniel 4. I'm sorry, Daniel 4 is when Nebuchadnezzar, all these weird names, Nebuchadnezzar gets humbled, right? He says, oh, look at this beautiful kingdom I've made, and God humbles him, and he becomes like a beast for 7 years until he finally bows the knee, or I think he got saved. And remember, he gives the whole gospel tract out to the empire of Babylon, which has many, many different countries. Then we go to chapter 5, where Nabonidus and Belshazzar are ruling, and the handwriting on the wall, and then King Darius comes in, the Medes and Persians comes in and takes over rule of Babylon, which brings us to chapter 6 with Cyrus Darius ruling. But we want to remember, I don't know if it's in this one, in between chapters 4 and 5, we have Daniel's visions of chapter 7 and 8. So when we get to 7 and 8, we want to remember that happened during the Babylonian rule, not during the Persian rule. So as we go into chapter 5 and chapter 6, Daniel already has the information of chapter 7 and 8. And then, chapter 6, where we are. All right, so let's get started in our books. All right, so Daniel 6:6-9, a prayer band. So I'm going to start at chapter 1, since it's been a while, and I'm going to read down through, I'm going to start, not chapter 1, chapter 6. I'm going to start at verse 1 and read down through verse 9. Quick read through chapters 1 through 5. All right, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss, right? That's monetary loss. He wants to get his taxes that are due him. 3, then Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. Remember that this is the third pagan official or leader that has seen this in Daniel. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. And this is where we pick up. So in Daniel 6:6, it says, Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. And when it says that these came by agreement, let me just see something here. They're coming at him. It's the Aramaic word regash, and it's to gather in a tumultuous throng. Like they came as a loud, like boisterous, excited, emotional, chaotic mob, an angry mob. This is not an orderly thing. And remember, he put 120 people over it, so I'm thinking it's all these guys minus Daniel. And they are coming to put their selfish agenda onto the king, right? So they come at the king with this, and these government officials greeted the king with respect and honor. That's just how they say, "O king, live forever." That's just how you would approach them out of respect. But really, in reality, they did not respect him or honor him with their behavior. And they knew he was going to promote Daniel, right? That's right before then. He was going to promote Daniel to be like his number 2 over the whole kingdom. And Daniel's a Jew, and they didn't like that idea. And so they sought deceptive measures to trick the king into signing Daniel's death sentence. But God, right? So the Aramaic word agreement means they came as a mob. They came en masse to present their plan to the king. So you just got to get that in your mind, like how they're coming at the king. And we want to remember King Darius's religious belief that he's a Zoroastrian, and they believe in like doing good, and that will help in their afterlife and stuff, and being kind and all those things. All right. So coming in this way would have communicated popularity and unity on the subject, and the king would have been flattered, making him blind to their treachery. So let's turn to John chapter 15. But I'll put this up. The magnitude of the scheme shows how many enemies Daniel had unjustifiably acquired. So John 15, verses 18 and 19. And this is Jesus speaking, and he says, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of this world, remember, the world hates you." And we see that with Daniel over and over. All right, Daniel 6:7. Sure. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. So we see the word all, right? This is how they come at the king. All of us, all these satraps and governors that you've chosen, this is what we think you should do. So right off the get-go, they start their argument, in their proposal with a blatant lie. And what they're accusing Daniel of, or what they're going to accuse him of, is being unloyal. And them coming to the king like this shows that they're not loyal, right? This really isn't about loyalty and the worship of the king, but it's about trapping Daniel. That's their focus, is getting Daniel. We do not want him over us, and we want to just get him out of the kingdom. And, you can speculate why. He's probably such an upright person. Like, they're not going to get away with any scheming or taking off the top of these taxes they're going to be collecting. And, there's going to be no extra benefit, I should say, for them with Daniel around. So they want to get rid of him. So in deception and disloyalty, they convince the king to pass a law under the guise of loyalty to the king, and it's all to trap Daniel. So, this law would put Darius on the level of a god for 30 days. Daniel's conspirators were well aware this law would appeal to the king's pride. It would be an irresistible proposal. I'm going to put this one up then read that. Okay. Anyone who didn't obey the new law would be fed to the starving lions. This was a barbaric form of capital punishment used by the Medes and Persians to put fear into the heart of any would-be criminal. So the Medes and Persians, they typically didn't deify themselves like the Babylonians or the Egyptians did. They didn't look at themselves like that generally. And so why would Cyrus want to do this? We got to get into Cyrus's mind a little bit, or Darius, whatever you want to call him. And because of his religious belief as a Zoroastrian, like he was a very religious man, it lent to his ecumenical practices. He believed in the freedom of religion, which we're going to see later God uses to send the Jews back to their land, right? He said, you're going to be in captivity 70 years and you're going to go back to your land, and that will be the fulfillment of that, starting under this Cyrus. But he didn't care. Cyrus didn't care what others worshiped so long as he could worship as he pleased. But this is just a temporary law that would bring about some unity and loyalty to the kingdom, right? It's going to show who's loyal to him, who's not. It's going to unify. It sounds like a good idea for just 30 days. And I'm fed to his ego and pride too. But so remember, the Zoroastrian, they thought that good thoughts, good works, good deeds were needed to be practiced to keep one's soul aligned with Asha and thus spreading happiness and the spiritual equality and duty of men and women alike to bring good for the sake of goodness and without the hope of reward. So this is kind of the mindset of him. And they believed in the cosmic battle and stuff. And so I'll say some more stuff about that later, but let's keep going. Okay, Daniel 6:8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Right? They keep stressing this to the king. So they keep emphasizing the law of the Medes and Persians couldn't be changed. So they did believe the laws came directly from the gods and once made couldn't be changed. So the king didn't necessarily think, like Nebuchadnezzar kind of thought like he was like functioning as a god. Cyrus really just thought the laws came from them and he was just to obey the laws, to enforce the laws and obey them. But unlike Babylon, where the king is the law, the Medes and Persians were not above the law. So there's kind of a different way of running things now. And they allowed the different provinces to practice their own laws even. But, so, the different provinces or countries, I guess they changed them into provinces, they could keep their laws that they had before Cyrus took over, unless he set a law. Then that would, go above and take precedent and over their laws at the time. And because the king's law was God's law, and as such applied to the whole empire. So every royal decree was considered irrefutable and unchangeable to be obeyed by all the subjects. And once a law was signed into practice, it couldn't be changed or stopped, even by the one who signed it in, the king. And they knew Daniel would not forsake his God. They knew this would make Darius helpless to save Daniel, and that was their whole point. And it's just a testimony to Daniel, like, we can't find anything on this guy. How are we going to get him? Oh, we know he's going to be faithful to his God, so that's how we'll attack him. And, it's a good thing for us to dwell on and think about. Or would we stand firm like this? Would we, keep moving our line in the sand there? Whoops, I think I missed something. Hold on. No. Okay. So the plan was a conspiracy that would outmaneuver even the authority of King Darius. And the conspirators pressured the king to draft and sign the law quickly because once signed, the law could not be changed. And the trap was set for Daniel. And let's just turn to Esther 8:8, because we see this. She's under the same rule, just at a different time. And, the same thing happened in her day with the law not being able to be changed. So Esther 8:8. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, so as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever it is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. And so we know what happened in her time is that the law was passed, and it was going to be like Kill a Jew Day. And to help that, another law had to be made because they couldn't stop that law, and the injunction that was made was Arm a Jew Day, right? So they're going to be able to fight back now. They aren't going to be helpless, which is a good thing for us to think about. Like, if we're armed, we're not helpless. Okay. So Daniel 6:9. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction, with the stroke of a pen. The king outlawed prayer to any god for 30 days. And there we see him signing it. He has a little pen in his hand, or quill, maybe, I don't know what they wrote with. So these conspirators knew two things. Daniel was faithful to pray, and the king had a gullible ego. So although they acted like they loved and honored the king, in reality they treated him as a fool. Because of his foolish pride, the king unsuspectingly fell for the plan. And so I thought of some verses. Proverbs 29:23 says, "A man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor." You know, and despite his religious beliefs, this probably did sound like a pretty good idea. Like, ooh, all right, I'll be like a god for 30 days, only 30 days, right? And then we contrast that with Luke 14:11. It says, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." And so that's what we're about to see with Daniel here. And then one more, Proverbs 29:20 says, "Do you see a man hasty in his words or hasty in his actions? There is more hope for a fool than for him." And, you know, he fell in instead of taking the time to really think this through to the end. And actually, I don't even think those officials really thought it through to the end, what the consequences would be once the king finds out what they're doing, and what the king was actually writing into practice, the consequences of that. I don't think anybody thought it through, except Daniel, actually. All right, so Daniel 6:10-11. So let's read that. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went and cowered in fear. No, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. So Daniel stayed faithful. He did not waver in his trust in the Lord. I should read this. Okay. So you can just fill in that word. So this is not a practice that Daniel just started that day. And he wasn't praying out of defiance, like, oh yeah, you're going to tell me to do that, I'm going to go do this. That was not in Daniel's character at all. This was Daniel's habit. Turn back to Daniel 2, and let's look at verses 17-18. And remember what happened when he found out what the king was doing with all the wise men, right? Slaughtering them. And he goes and asks the king for time, and then he goes back to his buddies that he's living with, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and this is what he does. In verse 17, it says, "Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon." And so this is a habit. I mean, Daniel is 18 at this time. Now he's 80. And so this is something he established in his life very early on. And let's notice that Daniel was just completely dependent upon the Lord. Like, that's where he went for all his issues. That's where he went all day for fellowship and encouragement, was to the Lord. And notice that what he's asking God for his felt needs, and he's giving thanks. So what is he praying about at this moment? What does he go back? He hears the decree. It's been signed. If you do this, you're going to be thrown into the lion's den. And he goes and prays. So what's he praying about? I don't think he's praying about the lion's den. I don't think that's even a concern in his mind, at least not yet. And we haven't seen Daniel's focus on himself at all thus far, from chapter 1 to now chapter 6. His focus is never on himself, but always on the Lord and on Israel. And so we're going to take a sneak peek at chapter 9. And I think this is what Daniel's doing. Let's look at chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So he has these scrolls from Jeremiah, and he's reading through them, and he comes across this, that their 70 years of captivity in Babylon is almost up. And so what does he do in verse 3? He says, I set my face toward the Lord God to make request by prayer and supplications, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And I prayed to the Lord my God and made confessions and said, O Lord, great and awesome God. And we're not going to go any further until we get there. But he saw, this is a sneak peek, okay? So what he sees is 70 years is coming to an end. He saw that it took about 15 years for the Medes and Persians to come in. Remember, we're going to see in 7 and 8 that he already knows there's more kingdoms that have to, another kingdom that has to come before Christ comes back, right? There's still 3 more things to happen. And he starts praying to God on Israel's behalf. And he kind of acts like they're priests, and he's praying to them and that God would just hurry up everything and bring in the kingdom. So I think that's what he's praying for here. I think that's what he was praying for, and I think he's continuing that, not saying, whatever you decree, it doesn't matter. I'm going to continue with the habit that I've developed of going to the Lord 3 days, and we'll see in a minute, this three times a day and all that. But I think he's praying for Israel. I think he's praying for his people, because that's what he had been doing. Okay, and there he is. And I'll just tell you, so it says he goes to his upper room to pray. So a lot of times their houses upstairs would have like on the roof would have like a little room built, and that's where he's going. So it wasn't private. You can see the people like meandering around outside, and this must be his nighttime prayer from the picture. Okay. So we'll skip this, but you can see, so they've entered 7 and 8 here, so you can see the timeline from Nabonidus, then 553 and 551. And then we get to chapter 6. Boop. And chapter 9, which we just, a little sneak peek. Okay. Daniel was resolute in his faith, even though he knew about the law, and that he'd die a gruesome death for breaking it. He entrusted himself to the Lord and continued worshiping him, just as he had always done. So let's take the time to look at these. Let's go to Acts, chapter 4, verse 29. Now, Lord, look on their threats and grant to your servants that with all boldness they may speak your word. And let's go ahead to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And we will read verse 12. Therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech. And then Philippians 1:14. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. And then 1 Peter 2:23. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. And we see that's what Daniel did. His focus was on the Lord, his trust was in the Lord, and he's bold. He's bold with his words when it's appropriate and he needs to speak. And he doesn't fight back. He puts his eyes on the Lord, just as Christ did. So despite the fearful law, Daniel rested in the Lord and went about his business as usual. So we're near Philippians, so let's just do Philippians 4:7, and then we'll go back to Isaiah. We'll travel backwards this time. Okay, so Philippians 4:7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds through Christ Jesus. Right? When that's our thinking is on the Lord and obeying him, he's going to, protect our thoughts and our thinking. All right, and then Isaiah 26:3. So this is always my birthing verse. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. And that's the key, is trust. Do you know God well enough that you trust him? Daniel did. Okay, 2, he did not stop praying or start praying in secret, right? He didn't stop his praying, his habit of prayer, and he didn't try to do it in secret. So I'm just going to go back to 1 Peter, and I'm going to read. We'll see that. He did not call his lawyers. He did not start a protest or write a petition. He did not do anything to try to defend himself or to try to get out of his predicament. Right? We don't see him fighting back. He just went about his business and said, Lord, it's in your hands. So 1 Peter 4:19 says, therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good, as to a faithful creator. And that's what Daniel did. And they knew Daniel's faithfulness to his God. And they knew of his habit of praying 3 times a day. This wasn't like they discovered this. They already knew this. And so Daniel had a choice. He had a choice on how he was going to respond to this issue that has just now come about. And if he stopped praying and started praying in secret for the 30 days, it would have ruined his testimony, right? Because they already know his habit. They already know what he does. That's why they're doing this way. And, if he stopped, it would have wrecked his testimony. And they would have known he was being unfaithful to his God. And they would have looked at his God in a completely different way. And we know that Daniel had already made up his mind, right? Daniel 1:8, that he was not going to defile himself before God. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what happened to him. He was not going to make a mockery of God's name. He was not going to lower God's character by protecting himself. And they were counting on that. So instead, Daniel chose to continue praying as usual. He must have believed that his fellowship with God was more important than his life or position, right? He didn't care. He didn't care that he was about to be head of state, which is funny. Like Daniel could have cared less about any of that stuff, but it was so important to these other guys, they want to get rid of him. So Daniel did not fear a physical death. So from Daniel 12:1-3, we know Daniel believed in a literal future bodily resurrection. So we'll take a little sneak peek at Daniel 12. We'll look at verses 1 through 3. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation even to that time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. And it's amazing what God reveals to Daniel once we get into it. It just shows Daniel's character and trust in God. All right, several Old Testament passages help us understand the intensity and intentionality of Daniel's prayer life. So Daniel prayed 3 times daily, as the writer of Psalm 55, 16 through 17 encouraged. So let's look at that, because this is kind of answer why he's doing his prayer the way he's doing it. So Psalm 55, verses 16 and 18. And so this is David. And he says, "As for me, I will call upon the Lord, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon." So what do we have? 1, 2, 3. "I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He has redeemed my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many against me." All right, and then let's look at this one. So Daniel prayed facing Jerusalem, as 1 Kings 8, 46 through 51 commanded Israel to do. So let's go back. And remember, this is what Daniel has for scripture, is these Old Testament books. And, he's a man of studying. He studies and researches and gets to know God. So he knew all these things about the different people that are in these Old Testament scriptures. All right, so chapter 8, verse 46. Says, "When they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they take them captive to the land of the enemy, far or near," right? So this is being prophesied what's going to happen. This when this happens is what this verse says. "Yet when they come to themselves in the land where they were carried captive and repent," right? When they finally say, "Oh my goodness, what have we done?" And they change their thinking and make supplication to you, right? They're going to come to God now and say, "Save us," "in the land of those who took them captive, saying, 'We have sinned and done wrong. We have committed wickedness,'" right? They're taking responsibility for their choices. "And when they return to you with all their heart," right? With all that they are, really, is what that's saying. In their thinking, who they really are, "and with all their soul," right? So their behavior, "in the land of their enemies who led them away captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name, then hear in heaven, your dwelling place, their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause." So this is the knowledge that Daniel has. Seems like he's following the pattern of David, right? I'm going to set aside 3 times a day to pray. It wasn't a religious thing. It wasn't like, if he had to miss it for whatever. It wasn't anything to do with that. He just decided, I'm going to do like David. He was a man after God's own heart. I'm going to be like him, and I'm going to set aside 3 times a day to pray. And he started praying this. He knows, when your people turn back to you, that's when it's going to happen. And so this is what he's patterned himself to start doing now. And this 1 Kings comes from Solomon's temple dedication. Okay, so Daniel had a copy of Jeremiah's writings. We see that in Daniel 9:2 that we just read. Jeremiah said to pray from captivity for the restoration of Israel, and God would hear and respond. And Daniel believed and acted on Jeremiah's prophecies. So let's look at Jeremiah 29. And we'll look at verses 11 and 13. So, okay, 11 through 13. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And let's read 14. I will be found by you, says the Lord, and I will bring you back from your captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, says the Lord. And I will bring you to the place from which I cause you to be carried away captive. And so this is something that Daniel knew too from Jeremiah, his contemporary. I don't know why I have. Oh, let's just keep looking at 29. Just go back to verse 10. It says, for thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you and cause you to return to this place. And so Daniel knows this. He's aware of this. And so he started praying for that to happen. So in Daniel 9, Daniel confessed his own sins as well as the sins of Israel. And we can safely conclude that he prayed consistently for Israel's release from captivity. So once Daniel gets this news that he reads from Jeremiah's scroll, he goes right to praying, which I'm assuming he already had the habit of praying 3 times a day, but then when he gets this information, that's what his thinking shifts to. And, he wanted his people released, but most of all, he wanted his nation to turn back to God. Okay, Daniel 6:11. Then these men came by agreement as a mob. Again, these men are just coming in this unruly, boisterous, loud mob fashion. And they found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. The conspirators' plan worked, largely because of Daniel's loyalty, the same trait, incidentally, that forced them to be honest in their jobs. Daniel's faithfulness got him into trouble, but his faith would bring him out. So again, we'll turn to Hebrews 11:33. But these men, they are anticipating Daniel's praying to his God and waiting to pounce on him, right? And their attitude was like, oh, now we got him. So they assume that being thrown into the lion's den equals sure death. Right? That's what they're thinking. Oh, he gets thrown in there, we'll be done with him. He'll be dead. But what they don't know is Daniel's God. He's the sovereign God, the creator God who created these lions, and they are about to see just how powerful Daniel's God is. So chapter 11, verses 30 through 33 says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, through faith worked righteousness, through faith obtained promises, and through faith stopped the mouths of lions. Right? So it's not Daniel who did this, it's God. God is the one who's going to protect Daniel. And there we see them. He's doing his prayer in his building, and they come as that angry mob. There's another picture that I was going to put in, except it was wrong because they were at like a ground level, but it's like Daniel praying, and then there's these people like peeking in his window, but I didn't do it, so sorry. Okay, back to Daniel. All right, so let's read 12 through 15. And they went before the king. Okay, hold on, let's go back to 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, well, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, do you remember Nebuchadnezzar's response when he heard they wouldn't bow down? Right? Thumos' anger just exploded. Well, look at this, Darius's response. He was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. And so that's what we just read, so you can fill in the word denounce. But it says they asked the king to confirm his decree and the punishment before they deliver the bad news, right? Isn't this what your decree said, O king? You know, the one that we wrote up and had you sign. Isn't that what it said? And he's, yes, that is what it said. And then they give the news of Daniel. And it's just crazy to me how everybody Daniel comes into contact with, these men, these big, strong men, they just fall in love with Daniel. They have this love towards Daniel that I just can't wait to meet Daniel. I don't know, like what was, it had to be his faith in God that was so attractive because, they saw something in him that they just loved, which was the Lord. Okay, Daniel 12b, it says, the king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. They received the exact answer they wanted. The king acknowledged that the law could not be revoked. He now had no legal option but to condemn Daniel to death. Right? And he had no one to blame except himself. 6:13 says, then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day, making an issue of Daniel's Jewish ethnicity and exile status. The conspirators made 2 inaccurate accusations against Daniel. So we see this bringing up of the Jewish exiles, right? We see it repeated. It's in Daniel chapter 1:2, in chapter 2:25, and chapter 3:13, and chapter 4:25, and chapter 5:13. And now we see it in chapter 6:13. It keeps getting mentioned, these Jews, these exiles, these captives. And for us, it should remind us that God is the one in control, right? Let's just look at Daniel 1:2 again. And so when we hear this is where our mind should go. And it says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, Nebuchadnezzar's, hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So in verse 2, it's the Lord. It's the Lord. All this is happening is because the Lord has allowed this to happen. And that's what we have to remember. God allows these things to happen for our good and his glory, really. So the Jews are their captives only because God had given them into these other nations' hands. And God was in control of all the events of chapters 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5. And that's kind of what Daniel's showing us. Like, God is the God of history. And here's some things that happened within here concerning how he is the one who is directing and guiding history, and nothing happens apart from him because he is in control, in complete control. But what we also see here is anti-Semitism, right? We constantly see that, and we're constantly always going to see that because there's somebody else that's behind the scenes trying to thwart God's plan. And so, Satan is whispering in these people's ears and causing them to hate the Jews. Really, if you think about it, there's all kinds of stuff going on nowadays with anti-Semitism and people accusing the Jews of this and that and stuff. But really, I don't see it. I don't see what they're seeing. They're just going along with like what the crowd is saying, and that's what we see throughout Scripture too. And what's their accusation? Does not show due regard for you, O king, or your decree. That's what they're accusing Daniel of here, which is a lie. So Daniel pays no attention to you, O king. They misrepresented Daniel when they asserted that he paid no attention to the king. Well, Daniel was loyal to the king, right? In fact, he's the most loyal one there out of the whole group, probably the whole kingdom. But his God was a higher authority than the king. So let's look at Acts 5:29. And so this is what happened when Peter and the other apostles were being accused. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." And nobody can argue with that. So they're accusing Daniel of not being loyal to the king, just like they did with Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael in Daniel 3. So we're going to keep seeing these parallels happening. And Daniel was very loyal to King Cyrus, but not at the expense of being disloyal to his God. He wasn't going to do it no matter what. He had his line drawn, and he stuck by it. Like, I will do whatever you want me to do as long as it doesn't defile me before my God, as long as it's not offensive before my God. And the reality is that Daniel, right, was the most loyal servant to the king. And Darius knows that, right? Once he sees what's going on. Okay. So Daniel pays no attention to the injunction which you signed. So here's their second accusation. They misrepresented Daniel by implying that he blatantly disregarded the king's law. And it's true. That is true. Daniel did pay no attention to that injunction. He had a choice, right? At that moment, when that injunction was signed and Daniel found out about it, he had a choice. And he chose wisely. He chose to obey the Most High God. And his motivation behind that was not rebellion. It was not disrespect for the king, but from his mindset of obedience, honor, and dependence upon God. That's how much he depended on God. That's how much he trusted God. He said, Lord, my life is in your hands. And if obeying you means being thrown and mauled by lions, that's what's going to happen. But I'm going to go pray. So Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, the accusations were a veiled repetition of the anti-Semitism we have seen throughout the book of Daniel and throughout history, right? Anti-Semitism is satanic. Satan wants to see God's nation, Israel, destroyed. Let's go back to Esther. I'm going to look at Esther. Okay, Esther 3, verse 6. Let's read verse 5 first. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. And so really, if you bring this back, Haman didn't really have reason to be angry. It was his pride and jealousy that prompted the whole destruction of Israel. That's what his goal was. All right, and then let's look at Psalm 83, verse 4. They have said, "Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more." Right? And I can't remember what famous person said it, but they were asked for proof of Israel, or proof of God. They were asking for proof of God, and the guy's response was Israel. Right? Israel shouldn't exist. It should have been obliterated a long, long time ago. But it's not, because they're God's people, and God has a plan for them, which we're going to see in Daniel. All right, Daniel 6:14. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. King Darius immediately recognized the dire legal consequences of the situation. He spent the balance of the day in a fruitless search for a loophole to preserve Daniel's life. I don't know if you can see him there. I think this is a picture of him at its wit's ends. Like there's no loophole, right? So at that moment, he realized he's been played. And it shows his feelings for Daniel that he starts looking for a loophole. This is the king. He doesn't say he ordered all the wise men from his kingdom to look for a loophole. He starts doing it. And he can't find one. But there is one. There is a loophole, and it's that it doesn't say die in the lion's den. It just says they'd be cast. They'd be thrown into the lion's den. So that's the loophole. But no one, not even the king, could save Daniel. Only God could. Only God could save with this loophole. So in this culture, they had to enforce a punishment by sundown. So if they came to him in the morning, he had all day. But by sundown, this punishment had to be enforced. So Darius, he's just dragging his heels to try to find a loophole. So at any moment, it doesn't have to be at sundown. That's when it starts. He could have sentenced him right to the lion's den right at that moment, but he waits until the absolute last minute, which is sundown. And God is allowing all this, though. He's allowing all this to show these people that he is in control. He is in control. No king, no leaders, but him. And so these men, Daniel 6:15, these men came by agreement. Again, they're showing up as this crazy mob to the king and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." And the law allowed the king no solution, and he was obligated to enforce the death penalty on Daniel. So these guys show up right at sundown. Right at sundown, they show up again and remind the king, right? They come as another chaotic mob, and they want to make sure that Darius is going to follow through on his decree. And when they speak, you can almost just hear the disdain in their voices, their words. And so they're just waiting all day. They probably sat outside the the palace waiting. So Darius was not a weak ruler. He made a bad choice. He didn't think through his choice, but he wasn't a weak ruler. And although at that moment his hands were tied, he had to fulfill the law's demands. He would remember who instigated this plot. So that's what I mean. Like, I don't think these guys thought through this plan on getting rid of Darius, how it was going to be played out. Like, eventually, it's going to be revealed to the king what they did. Right? Eventually, within just a little bit. And I don't think they anticipated the king's response. But I guess usually these kind of evil people don't think through their things. So the king would not have appreciated the facts that he was being manipulated any more than you or I would. You cannot poke a bear without getting a ferocious response. And I put that little bear up there. Can you see? It's just bear you have to fill in. So, all right. Are you good to switch slides? Okay. Right, we have till 11:30, right? I'll let you just look at that bear for a while and think about that. Yes. Yeah, I don't know.
Or is it just nobody's tattling on him now?
It's probably that.
Away.
Yeah, it's probably nobody's, all the enemies dealt with, yeah. Maybe, yeah. Okay. I gotta see this. Oh man, I had my thing all cleaned up too, and then I pulled out all these pictures. Okay, it's this one. I learned. It's a teaching moment. I love it.
One thing I thought of back when Daniel 6:10, when he said, are they ready?
Go ahead, you can say it.
He said, Daniel continued kneeling
Mm-hmm.
on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks to
Mm-hmm.
his God. And when we jump to Philippians 4, we read verse 7,
Mm-hmm.
but in verse 6, it instructed us
To give thanks.
give thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
We don't often give thanks.
Yeah.
We cry out to the Lord.
Right.
Does God want us in the posture of thanking Him
Mm-hmm.
for
Well,
what we're going through?
yeah. Well, think about what that does to our mentality when we give thanks to Him. It shows gratitude and a dependence upon Him.
And it usually weeds out what you really need to be praying for, because it puts you in a different mindset after you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for pointing that out in verse 10. Yep. Yeah. It's amazing. Okay, we won't go through this again. I'm going to quiz you on that at the end, though. When we get to chapter 12, I'm going to quiz you on the timeline. I'm going to give everybody a blank timeline. And I'm just kidding. All right, let's go ahead and we'll read through verses 16 through 22. Okay. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the lion's den, the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also, his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." And that's what we're going to read to. All right, so let's look at this. All right, Daniel 6:16a. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. He's thrown into the lion's den. And this is the same word we see used in chapter 3 for Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, right? They're thrown into the fiery furnace. So in the literary simplicity of ancient writings, the author concisely summarized Daniel's doom, and that's what that assumes. When they're cast into the fiery furnace, they're dead. Cast into the lion's den, he's dead, and that's the assumption behind that. And it also shows, like, you know, Daniel has no control over this. He has no control of going into the lion's den. He has no control of coming out of the lion's den. 6:16b. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." The king's confidence in Daniel's God, that he was able to deliver Daniel from a bunch of hungry lions, shows great faith. He was familiar with this. Or was he familiar with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Or was it the result of Daniel's life and testimony? I'm going to guess both. So it's interesting, though, that the king, he adds this word constantly. And by this point, Daniel's been serving the Lord faithfully for 70 years. And, you know, the king put Daniel in charge over the whole kingdom, so he kind of has to know exactly what kind of man Daniel is in order to do that. And I'm sure he has heard of Daniel's God. It's not like the kingdom, if we saw a map, was close to Babylon. And if Daniel was a head of state in Babylon, he probably traveled, and it's likely he even met, other kings and heads of states and stuff. And I'm sure word of these miracles, the lion's den and stuff, went out, and these guys heard it. I'm sure they've heard of this God of the Israelites. We know they did, because they knew of Israel and the things that God had done for Israel. But now that they're in captivity, their God still is the strongest, the most high. And so I'm sure that the king knew that stuff about him. And if Darius isn't a believer, and I'm sure Daniel's testimony, it's probably stumped Darius. Like when you have religious people, because we know Nebuchadnezzar was a religious man, and Darius or Cyrus is a religious man, and they're doing all these works and things, but here's this godly man and the other three boys even, and they see this. There's something different about them. Like, I'm faithful to my God and, doing all these religious acts, but there's something different about them. And it probably stumped them. They probably were lost and didn't understand it, but they wanted to be around it. Both kings took Daniel and put them right by their side. So they're probably puzzled about this belief, and they're probably interested in it. All right, Daniel 6:17. So a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Steps were taken to ensure the execution of Daniel was fulfilled properly according to the letter of the law. And so here's a signet ring from Persia. They call it Cyrus the Great's signet ring. I'm not sure. I read different things. Cyrus is not, I didn't think he was, like, the kingdom of the Medes and Persians is not represented by a lion, but I don't know. So it is a real signet ring, though. So whether it's really his or not, I don't know. And then here's a picture of him sealing it with his signet ring. I don't think this is an actual, I think what would have happened is, like, what I read was they had these holes in the ground. Maybe it was similar to this, and then it was just like a pit, and then they would cover the pit, kind of like they did with tombs, and they would cover it so that you're just in this dark pit. There's no light. It's just a dark pit, and that's where the lions were. I also read that there might have been like a wall, so he might have fallen in, and then they released the lions, and maybe that's for the purpose of being able to clean and stuff. I don't know, but it's interesting. Okay, so while the seal with the signet ring served as proof that the decree had been carried out, it also ensured that no one disrupted the execution. So clearly, no one would dare break the seal for fear of retribution. But this fact would also serve as absolute proof that God alone delivered Daniel. No one could ever say some person rescued him. And let's go to Matthew 27. And I love when God uses man's strength to show them his. Right? Here's these people, because it's not just Daniel who put his signet ring. Supposedly, it says all of them did, thinking they're strong and they're in power. And God's like, oh yeah? Let me show you something. All right, so Matthew 27, 62 through 66. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, command the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead,' so that the last deception will be worse than the first." And Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. And what they really were doing was making no argument that Christ rose from the dead. That's what they were doing. They were securing that truth, thinking they had this power to fight against it. And that's what these people, they don't take God into account. And these are like Jewish people. Okay. All right, so here's a beautiful painting of Daniel, and I like this because you see how it's like all dark, but what's behind Daniel? Light. What's lighting this lion's den? And look at the lion's faces. It's like, look at that one, like cowering. They look scared, and they're just, Daniel's just standing there calmly. And sorry about that. So, he just looks calm, and I think Daniel's about to have the night of his life. All right, Daniel 6:18. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. The thought of losing Daniel to the lions robbed the king of his sleep and his appetite. Right, and then meanwhile in the lion's den, this is what's going on with Daniel. Right? Calm. He's with an angel of the Lord, like. But here's what the king's night looked like. And so it's interesting that the king, he is so upset, he's so distraught by this, that he doesn't eke or seek distraction from entertainment. Right? Isn't that what we usually do? Like, I don't want to think about it. I'm gonna distract myself with other things. The king doesn't do this. He owns his feelings, or I guess, or he just is, it's so much he can only think about it. And so we see the depth of his worry and concern for Daniel. So Daniel 6:19, the king arose at dawn. So soon as it must have been like, that must have been a rule. You have this long, and then if they're okay, then they're okay. Punishment's over. So then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. And the fact that the king rushed quickly to see Daniel's fate showed faith. His faith, weak as it was, held out hope of hearing Daniel's voice from below. And so we see this King Darius has some expectation that Daniel's God could and would deliver in him. And he doesn't just meander down to the den. He goes in haste. That's not typical of a king to rush to somebody else, right? And that word haste, it conveys the sense of like sudden alarm, that it drives like an inner turmoil or outward urgency, right? He was so in such turmoil, he went in haste to find what had happened to Daniel. In Daniel 6:20, when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And here we see King Darius's basic understanding of God as he trembly called out to Daniel. And we're going to go to the Hebrews verse, but I just wanted to tell you this word cried out. It conveys an impassioned, almost like a guttural cry that springs from deep distress. It conveys an impassioned, just deep distress, and it distills the essence of urgent, heartbroken appeal. And that's how the king felt. And it doesn't just say that. It doesn't just say he cried out. It says in a lamenting, so a pained voice. The king has been tormented all night about this situation, and the deep sorrow and grief he has been feeling, it comes out now when he calls out to Daniel. And there's absolutely nothing the king could do about it but wait and see if Daniel's God saved him. And I think he probably had a long night maybe thinking about who this God of Daniel's was. And, And another interesting thing as I was meditating on this, thinking about, is that we don't hear King Darius once appeal to his God. He doesn't once appeal to his God over the situation, and especially since the words to describe his God, I looked up what is some words of Ahu Mazda or whatever the God's name is, and different words, there's a list of words, almost a lot of similarities between the Most High God. But some things that describe his God are merciful, a protector, a remover of affliction, a remover of suffering, a remover, or generous with justice. So if that's his God's character, why isn't he calling out to his God? I was like, interesting. That's what kept me up all night. All right. So the king. Let's look at Hebrews 11:6, or I can just read it if you want. Okay, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, right? That means that God is all that he says he is. You must believe that. And that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, right? That's our responsibility. And so the king had a basic but important understanding of God's attributes. He spoke of God as the living God. Let's read Romans 1:19 through 20. And I just had the privilege of teaching this on Monday night, all 16 books, what was supposed to be an hour. And this is just an amazing book, but this especially. So in verse 19, well, let's start in 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And that word thankful means gratitude. They did not give God the proper gratitude that is due him. And it led to them being darkened. They were without divine truth in their thinking. And so if you don't have any divine truth in your thinking, what are your decisions going to look like? And that's what's happening. But this verse in Romans tells us, which is beautiful when we think about this, because we can have confidence when we witness to somebody because they already know who God is. We don't have to prove God to them. They already know. They might claim to not know, but this is what they're doing then. They're suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, and they get angry. That's their response, is to anger and fight back at you because they know they're being convicted of suppressing what they know. And so the king, he already knew who this God is because God has made it manifest to us. Anybody who is honest and they go out and look at God's creation, knows something created it. There's a God who created it. All right, so the king had a basic understanding of the living God. Okay, so the phrase living God, when he calls us out, the phrase living God, this is what he's saying. He's acknowledging God, Daniel's God, that his divine self-existence, right? God's life is underived and inexhaustible. That's what he's proclaiming. He's proclaiming ongoing involvement, meaning like God acts within history, intervening to save and to judge. And we see that in Daniel 6:20 and in Daniel 4:17. And he's also proclaiming absolute kingship. His living nature guarantees an unending reign, foreshadowing the everlasting kingdom of the Son of Man, which we're going to see when we get to Daniel 7, verses 13 through 14. So in that little thing, when he calls out the living God, that's what's in his thinking. That's what he's proclaiming. All right, the king must have had somewhat of a friendship with Daniel. He cared a lot about Daniel's welfare. He knew Daniel constantly served his God, right? We don't hear much about Daniel. We get snapshots of Daniel's life, but what we can derive from Daniel's life and these people that interact with him and how they feel about him, that Daniel, he was vocal about his God, and his life manifested his relationship with his God. It reflected it. And Daniel was obviously not ashamed of his God, and the king clearly respected him for it. 4, not only did Daniel live his faith, he probably talked about his God, since the king had a basic understanding of what Daniel's God was like. Right? Where's he getting this information from if it's not from Daniel? I'm sure that's probably why I wanted him next to it. Imagine they're having like these, theological discussions, his God versus Daniel's God, maybe. I don't know. The king believed Daniel's God had the power to save him from the hungry lions, which is interesting. Again, he doesn't call out to his God, but to Daniel's. All right, Daniel 6:21. Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever." So Daniel responded with respect for the king, indicating that he harbored no resentment toward him. Right? And this is the first time in this book, in this chapter, that we see Daniel speak. And his words are just a common greeting, showing respect toward the king. Daniel 6:22a says, Daniel gave credit for his deliverance. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. Right? And when we compare this with, we'll compare it with Daniel 3:28. Let's look at Daniel 3:28. We see though with Daniel too, when something happens, his first response is, God gave me. God is the one who did this. All right, so Daniel 3:28 says this. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him." All right, we'll go on. And have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. And so we see that's the happenings with when those boys were delivered in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But we see these similar words, angel, right? There's an angel involved. God sent his angel and saved us. And we're going to see trust too, the word trust. So we see that in verse 28 where it says, delivered his servants who trusted in him. And we'll see that in Daniel 6 and a little further down. All right, so let's look at Psalm 33:8. It's interesting, these pagan kings are recognizing these things too. 33:8 says, Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. And this is what God does to these kings. They have nowhere to go but to admit who the Most High God is and his character. Go over the page to chapter 34, verse 7. And it says this: the angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them. And deliverance might look different. You might be delivered into the Lord's hand that day. And these boys or men knew it. They knew that could be the possible outcome, but it didn't change their fear of God. It didn't change their trust in God. Them being delivered reinforced it maybe, but that didn't matter. That wasn't their focus. It didn't matter what happened to them. They feared God because they knew who God was. They knew God's character, and they knew he was able to, if that was part of his will. And that's another thing for us to think about. Are we walking in God's will? Are we doing what we want to do and fulfilling our desires and pleasures? Are we walking in God's will and fulfilling his plan, his desires for our life? All right, so we'll see that a little further on. So here we go. I love this picture too. It's a little different, but I love, the king's been up all night, and he goes, and I don't know how he moves this big stone. He probably had guys with him, but look at Daniel. He's just sitting unbothered in this photo, and it almost seems like he's surprised to see the king, like, oh, is it morning already? And, you just imagine him there all night, just conversing with this angel of the Lord, whoever he is. It could be the pre-incarnate Christ that's there. It could maybe be Michael the archangel. We're not told specifically who this angel of the Lord is, but just that he's there and that he has shut the lions' mouths. And look, he's not cold. He's snuggling up with these lions and just looks like he's just sitting. He looks calm and rested, doesn't he? And just like, oh. That's why I put that in. So, all right. So Daniel was delivered to the lions by the king's edict, but delivered from the lions by God's angel. So the angel that came may have been an angel from the Lord or the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ. Daniel spent the night with this important and amazing guest. And isn't that, I just love thinking that, here these men intend for evil, and these men they stand firm. It doesn't matter. We will die then. And in both cases, in chapter 3 and chapter 6, with these men being cast into either the fire furnace or the lion's den, is that God shows up, whether it's the pre-incarnate Christ or it's an angel. He shows up or sends his messenger to show up and just spend time with these guys. They probably didn't want to leave, I would imagine. I'm good in the den, or, we'll stay in the fire longer. But that's what God still does for us too. And it made me think about people who do get martyred, they're being tortured and stuff, but, maybe God is there, and he is there with them, right? He says he shows up with the angels to deliver them, and I don't know, it's a good thought. So how amazing that Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, absolute trust in God, even in the face of death, led to God comforting and encouraging them in this way. And that's what God's doing. He delivered them. He sent God, he showed up to comfort and encourage them through their whole ordeal of, unjustly being punished. So Daniel 6:22b. Next, Daniel tactfully declares his innocence before God and king. Inasmuch as I was found innocent before him and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. And so innocent, this means he's morally pure. There's no immoral thing in him. And Daniel has a clean standing before God that results in divine protection and public vindication. And so this statement shows that man's laws, when they contradict the laws of God, are not valid, right? We should not heed to them, and rightfully so. And that might mean persecution. So if you disobey a human law in order to obey God's law, your conscience is clear. And that's how we see it with both these guys. They didn't fight for their lives. They didn't try to argue or defend themselves. They just made the statement like, we're not going to disobey our God to obey you. And they were calm, and they just made their statement of that, and they were sentenced to death. So even so, you may suffer penalties, persecutions, or even death for your disobedience. So just as God shut the lions' mouths because Daniel trusted him, so also God saves every person who puts his trust in the person and work of Christ. Daniel could do nothing to save himself from the lions, any more than we can save ourselves from sin's penalty. And God alone saves people, and he does so freely by his grace through the finished work of Christ on Calvary. And then I put this up. This is Hebrews 11:33. It says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of the lions. So Daniel couldn't save himself. The king couldn't save Daniel. Only God could save Daniel, and God used this situation to show the king just who he is. Really, and what was God's intention really is to show King Cyrus and all these other people the gospel, really. And then it says in John 1:12, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name. And God isn't willing that any should perish. And so he used these two incidences of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we'll say, and Daniel to show them who he was, because he didn't want these kings to perish. He didn't want any of those men to perish. And then John 3:36 says, he who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. So every one of us is born under God's wrath. And we as believers, though, we have the message of everlasting life. So let us be like Daniel and live lives that glorify God and show people who our God is, right? Because he's the same God that Daniel bowed down to and worshiped and obeyed. Same God today, right? Because we know our God does not change. And so that's it. We have one more set of slides for Daniel 6. Actually, I'll go back here. And then we'll move on to chapter 7. All right, I'll close in prayer. Father, we just thank you just for your words, these scripture words, Lord, these testimonies that show us who you are, Lord, that you have preserved for us so that we can see how you work in history. We can see that you are above all and that you are in control of all and that nothing happens without your knowledge and your consent. And we thank you for that, Lord. We thank you that as we get into Daniel, we're going to see that you have revealed the whole history of the times of the Gentiles to us, Lord. In your grace, you did not have to do that, but you did. And we thank you for that. And I just pray that we would just consider who you are. Really, really think about who you are, Lord. The God that we serve, especially as we see things just imploding in on themselves in our country and all over the world, Lord. We see history being driven, Lord. And as we are part of the reality of it, Lord, just help us to remember that you're in control of it and that we can just rest in you. And so we give all glory to you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, any thoughts or questions?